So for lesson 12, we actually started out by graphing this function on Desmos, and hopefully what you were going to get out of that was that when you graphed it, it hit the x-axis like 4 different times. Okay, so you're going to have 4 different solutions. So what we wanted to talk about, and where it hits, are some pretty kind of ugly numbers. They're not nice even numbers like 3 and 4 and 5. So our task is to find those solutions algebraically instead of using Desmos or some other graphing utility. So now what I'm going to do is we actually skipped the part about completing the square, so we're just going to go through and we're going to skip those particular problems. And you can go ahead and flip your paper over to the top of page 2. So what we focused on instead was what's called the quadratic formula. And the quadratic formula lets you find all real solutions to any quadratic function. So a quadratic function is always in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c. Okay? And a is the number or the coefficient in front of the x squared, b is the coefficient in front of the x, and c is your constant number in this case. So this is the quadratic formula. We're not going to get into how to derive it. I'm just going to give it to you and we're going to work from there. So the quadratic formula is the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all of that over 2a. And if you go on YouTube and you type in quadratic formula song, they'll sing it along to the tune of Pop Goes the Weasel. And I'm not going to do that to you because it would probably border on child abuse because I'm such a bad singer. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's start figuring this out. We've got, what is our a value? Our a value is 1. It's the number in front of our x squared. Our b value is negative 6. And our c value is 3. So now we're going to take those numbers and we're going to plug them in to our quadratic formula. So the opposite of b, so the opposite of negative 6 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a, which was 1, times c, which is negative 3, all of it over 2 times a, which is 1. So now I'm going to simplify this. So the opposite of negative 6 is 6, plus or minus the square root. Negative 6, make sure you have the parentheses around the negative 6, so it's negative 6 squared. So negative 6 times negative 6 is positive 36, minus, and then you have negative 4 times 1 times negative 3, so minus negative 12, sorry, it's getting squished a little bit down there, over 2, so I'm going to draw my arrow, equals 6 plus or minus the square root of 48, okay, over 2. 48, I can break up 48 into 16 times 3. So I'm just going to rewrite the square root of 16 times the square root of 3. So I get 4 times the square root of 3. So I've got equals 6 plus or minus 4 times the square root of 3 all over 2. If I look here, all of my terms here are even, which means they can be simplified by factoring out a 2. So I get 3 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 3. That's where my solutions will be. So one solution will be at 3 plus 2 times the square root of 3, and one will be at 3 minus 2 times the square root of 3. Okay, let's keep moving on. Now I'm going to look at this 2x squared minus 4x minus 7. So the first thing I want to do is I want to write out my quadratic formula. Sorry, I was looking through some papers here. Just want to make sure I'm putting down the right answers for you guys. So it's the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So let's look at this. Our a value is 2, our b value is -4, and our c value is -7. So I'm going to plug it into the equation. The opposite of -4 plus or minus the square root of -4 squared minus 4 times 2 times -7 over 2 times 2. So that becomes 4 plus or minus the square root. -4 times -4 is 16. 4 times 2 times 7. 8 times 7 is 56, and it's going to be positive because you have two negatives multiplied by each other, over 4. So it's 4 plus or minus the square root of 72 over 4. So a little thought bubble up here. Square root of 72. 72 is the same thing as 36 times 2. So it's the same thing as 6 times the square root of 2. So this all becomes 4 plus or minus 6 square root of 2 over 4. All of my terms in my numerator and my denominator are even, so I can factor out a greatest common factor of 2 out of all of those. So I'm going to get 2 plus or minus 3 square root of 2 all over 2. Now again, those are really ugly numbers, but when you plug them into the graph, you're going to see they actually, those are where the graph hits the x-axis. Okay, let's keep going. So we're going to do this one more time again using the quadratic formula. So we have a new one. If you plug this equation into Desmos, you can see where it's going to hit the x-axis. If you want to write those points down just so you can check them when you're done, that's pretty awesome. Okay, let's look at the quadratic formula. We have the opposite, oops, darn it, my pen function didn't work. The opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, so my a value is 1, b is -2, c is -4. So I have the opposite of -2 plus or minus the square root of -2 squared minus 4 times 1 times -4 over 2 times 1. So I get 2 plus or minus the square root of 4, and then -4 times -4 is 16. Don't need that to be so long. Over 2. So 2 plus or minus the square root of 20 over 2. So 20 can be written as the square root of 4 times the square root of 5, which is 2 times the square root of 5. And so I've got 2 plus or minus 2 square root of 5 all over 2. All of my terms in my numerator and my denominator are divisible by 2, so that's my greatest common factor. So I'm finally going to rewrite this as 1 plus or minus the square root of 5. Those values, 1 plus the square root of 5 and 1 minus the square root of 5, that is where the graph of this equation will hit the x-axis. That's where our solutions are. I'm going to do one more. Okay, finish out this problem. So remember, write out our quadratic formula. The more you write it out, the more it's going to help you memorize it. Okay. All right, a is 3, b is 8, c is -3. So let's go ahead and put this in here. The opposite of 8 plus or minus the square root of 8 squared minus 4 times 3 times -3 over 2 times 3. So I get negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 64, and then that becomes 4 times 3 is 12, times 3 is 36, and it's positive over 6. So that becomes negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 100 over 6, which becomes negative 8 plus or minus 10, because the square root of 100 is just 10, over 6. So what we have here is we have negative 8 plus 10, which is 2 over 6, which is 1/3 for one solution. And then negative 8 minus 10 is negative 18 over 6, which is 3. There's our other solution. And again, if you plugged in those two equations into decimals or into graphing calculator, you would see that those are the values of x, where the graph hits the axis. Okay, that's enough for today.